There's no denying that Breath of the Wild is one of the most popular Legend of Zelda games ever made. Aside from being the best-selling title in the series by a wide margin, the game is consistently praised for how it shook up the Zelda formula. From the massive open world, to the new gameplay mechanics, to the different approach to storytelling, Breath of the Wild was successfully able to change things up while still retaining that core Legend of Zelda experience. I myself am a huge fan of Breath of the Wild. I consider it to be my second favorite Zelda game behind Ocarina of Time, which is why I was so excited when Age of Calamity was announced back in September. The game came out of nowhere, taking everyone by surprise. It marketed itself as the prequel to Breath of the Wild, where you'll be battling the forces of Calamity Ganon in an effort to stop its resurrection. If you've played Breath of the Wild, you already know how the story goes. The champions get wiped out, the guardians and divine beasts turn on the people they were supposed to protect, and Link is brought to the verge of death and placed on the Shrine of Resurrection. While these events were discussed in Breath of the Wild, we never actually see most of them. Age of Calamity was a chance to see those events firsthand and flesh out the story even more. While I was very excited for this game's story, I was also a little worried about its gameplay. You see, rather than being a typical adventure game, like most every other Legend of Zelda title, Age of Calamity was instead developed as a Musou game, which basically means a mission-based hack-and-slash style game. This type of game has you fight your way through wave after wave of enemies using big flashy moves as you work to complete different objectives. These can range from eliminating a certain number of enemies, to capturing outposts, to defending a specific target. The most notable example of a Musou style game would be the Dynasty Warriors franchise. Basically, Age of Calamity's gameplay is very different from your typical Legend of Zelda game, especially when compared to Breath of the Wild, where open exploration and non-direct combat are a big part of the gameplay experience. Why would the Zelda team decide to make this style of game for the prequel? Well, when the game was announced back in September, the game's producer mentioned that Eiji Aonuma, the producer of the Legend of Zelda series, approached his team with the idea of making this prequel a warrior-style game. Because of the large battles that were fought against Calamity Ganon's forces, he thought it made more sense to tell this story through a warrior-style game rather than through an adventure game. Looking back at those comments now, I totally see where he was coming from, but at the time, I was a bit skeptical. Normally, I'm not a fan of Musou games. It's a perfectly fine genre, it's just not really my cup of tea. My main issue with it is that the gameplay usually gets too repetitive for me and I simply lose interest. That's what kept me from playing the first Hyrule Warriors game, even though I did consider trying it numerous times. The only reason I had any interest in playing Age of Calamity in the first place was because it had to do with Breath of the Wild. The fact that its development was overseen by the actual Zelda team also gave me more confidence in both the story and the gameplay. Fortunately, Nintendo released a demo for this game a couple weeks before it released, so I had a chance to check out the game to see if I'd actually enjoy the gameplay. The demo succeeded in reducing my concerns about the combat and in making me more excited for the rest of the game. I made a video giving my impressions of the demo and telling people why I thought they should be excited for Age of Calamity. Now that I've played the full game, I have no problem telling you that this game is freaking awesome and well worth the price of admission. The story ended up being more than even I thought it would be, and the gameplay turned out to be a lot of fun. I never really got bored with any of it, which is surprising considering my general stance on the genre. The best way I can describe my experience with Age of Calamity is to tell you that the game left me with a strong feeling of satisfaction. In a weird way, both the story and the gameplay of Age of Calamity addressed some of the issues I had with Breath of the Wild. I got more of the story I loved, and I got to fight without having to worry about weapons breaking constantly, which is one of the few critiques I have for the original game. While they're obviously not the same type of game, Age of Calamity really felt to me like an alternate version of Breath of the Wild in many ways, which I thought was a pretty cool thing. What I want to do in this video is have an open discussion about Age of Calamity rather than a typical review. I'm still going to be discussing the different aspects of the game and how I feel about them, I'm just going to be discussing the full game, spoilers and all. I had a great time with this game and I really just want to talk about it without having to hold back because of spoilers. With that being said, if you haven't played Age of Calamity and don't want things spoiled, I recommend you stop watching this and come back when you've had a chance to play it. If you have played Age of Calamity or you just don't care about spoilers, then stick around because I'm going to tell you why I think Age of Calamity is such a great game. So I think the best place to start is the story for obvious reasons. Age of Calamity is not actually the prequel I think we were all expecting. The game does cover the events described in Breath of the Wild, but it presents an alternate version of them instead, and it all has to do with this little time-traveling guardian named Teriko. First, let's talk about the background of Breath of the Wild's story and how that gets changed in Age of Calamity. Long ago, Calamity Ganon threatened all of Hyrule as Ganon usually does. He was ultimately sealed away by the hero who wielded the Master Sword and the Princess of Hyrule at the time. time. They were aided by an army of mechanized soldiers called Guardians and 4 massive machines called the Divine Beasts. About 100 years before the events of Breath of the Wild, it was prophesied that Calamity Ganon would return to Hyrule after 10,000 years. King Rome decided to start preparing for this threat by uncovering the Guardians and Divine Beasts, finding the new hero who will seal away the darkness, and training Princess Zelda to use the power of the goddess Hylia that dwells within her. Everything seems to be going well, except for the fact that Zelda has trouble unlocking her power. When the Calamity finally does return, it surprises everyone by taking control of the Guardians and Divine Beasts, which were supposed to protect everyone. The Guardians rampage through Hyrule, and the creatures that took control of the Divine Beasts end up killing the 4 champions that were selected to pilot the machines. Left alone to fight the Calamity, Link is brought to the verge of death while trying to protect Princess Zelda. Right before he can be killed, however, Zelda finally awakens her power in a moment of desperation, saving Link and preventing Ganon's victory. Zelda brings Link to the Shrine of Resurrection to heal, then goes to face Calamity Ganon alone, where she manages to keep him at bay for 100 years. These are the events that I expected to see when playing through Age of Calamity. What we got instead was an alternate version of these events that came about because of Terraco's time traveling. When he first arrives on the scene, Terraco doesn't really influence things too much. He warns everyone that the threat that was prophesied is actually real, but other than that, he doesn't really do much for the first half of the game. His impact is mainly felt in the second half when Calamity Ganon finally makes his return. At that point, he's taken over Hyrule Castle and seized control of the Guardians and the Divine Beasts. Everything pretty much seems like it's going to play out exactly like we expected to, until Terraco uses his time-traveling power to bring in reinforcements from the future. Before the champions can be defeated, they are rescued by characters from Breath of the Wild. These are the characters that helped you regain control of the Divine Beasts 100 years in the future. Their arrival saves the champions, thus altering the course of events quite significantly. With the champions still alive and the Divine Beasts back under their control, in addition to the extra help from the future, Link and Zelda are no longer left alone to fight the Calamity. By working together, they are able to turn the tide of the war in their favor. You're able to participate in the battles that we hear about in Breath of the Wild, like the battle at Fort Hateno and the assault on Akala Citadel, and actually win them. These victories lead to a final confrontation with Calamity Ganon at Hyrule Castle, which happens 100 years earlier than it's supposed to. Everyone works together to vanquish the Calamity and bring peace to Hyrule. This game basically tells the story of how the fight against the Calamity was supposed to go if the champions had survived, with some time travel thrown in there. Clearly a very different outcome from what was described to us in Breath of the Wild. From what I've gathered, this change in events has upset a lot of people, understandably so. Age of Calamity was marketed as a prequel to Breath of the Wild, so many people were expecting the story to follow the exact events as they were told to us. I even saw some people comment that they wanted the final scene of the game to be Zelda saying "open your eyes" like she does at the beginning of Breath of the Wild, which, to be honest, still sends chills through me every time I think about what could have been. However, that's not what happened. Instead, we got an alternate version of events that basically ignored Breath of the Wild's story completely and gave everyone a happy ending. I'll be the first to admit that I am disappointed we didn't get a true prequel to Breath of the Wild. The story that game presented was just amazing, and the chance to actually see those events play out was too good an opportunity to pass up. The fact that we didn't end up getting that is a bit of a letdown. Now, with that being said, I kinda really like Age of Calamity's story. I know, I just got through saying how disappointed I was that this game was not the prequel I was expecting or hoping for, but honestly, what we got instead was, in many ways, just as good. One of the things I was looking forward to the most was seeing more of the relationships between the different main characters. I wanted to see more of Zelda's relationship with both Urbosa and her father, more of the dynamic between the 4 champions and Link. I wanted to see some of the characters from Breath of the Wild in their youth and how they interacted not only with each other but with the main characters as well. These relationships are things that we actually got to see in Age of Calamity. In many ways, the first half of the game really could be considered a true prequel to Breath of the Wild. We get to see how the champions were recruited, how Link came to acquire the Master Sword, and how everyone prepared for the Calamity. With the exception of a couple time-traveling elements, the story in the first half of the game progresses more or less how you might expect it to. I really enjoyed these interactions and the way they fleshed out the characters I liked from Breath of the Wild. The cutscenes felt like they were pulled directly from that game, staying true to Breath of the Wild style. I found myself once again immersed in this fantastic story that I'd come to love over the last few years, smiling at the lighthearted moments and staring in awe at the different action cutscenes. And there were some amazing action cutscenes, usually involving Link. His fight against Astor in front of the Great Deku Tree and his fight against the 4 Blight Ganons are 2 of the battles that stand out to me in particular, along with Urbosa's fight against Lightning Blight Ganon. I sort of have a soft spot for big epic action sequences, which is probably why I enjoyed the second half of this game so much. Once the champions are saved by what we'll call the future champions, the game enters full-on war mode, where you fight in the battles described in Breath of the Wild. You get to defend Akala Citadel, and you actually get to see what it looks looks like inside, which I thought was pretty cool. You get to fight in the battle for Fort Hiteno, where Link is supposed to fall and Zelda is supposed to awaken her power, which she actually does in this game as well. Then you get to take on Calamity Ganon at Hyrule Castle in an epic final showdown, which, in my opinion, may have been more epic than the final battle against Ganon in Breath of the Wild. Everyone gets to be there and participate, and the stakes feel almost higher than they do in Breath of the Wild, most likely due to the build-up over the course of the game that Breath of the Wild never really has. My only problem with Breath of the Wild's story was that there simply wasn't enough of it. I love the lore that they established over the course of that game, but aside from a few cutscenes with the future Guardians and the memories you collect across Hyrule, there really isn't a ton of story, particularly present-day story. On top of that, the open format of the game meant the story wasn't as linear as I would have liked it to be. You can free the Divine Beasts in any order you want, or ignore them completely and just go straight to fight Calamity Ganon. The memories can also be collected in any order you want, so you may potentially see all of them out of order like I did the first time I played. I think that's fine from a gameplay perspective. I mean, Breath of the Wild's openness is part of what makes it a special and fantastic game, but from a story perspective, it kind of creates this disjointed story that doesn't execute as well as I would like it to. Age of Calamity fixes that by not only having a linear story, but a lot of story. It really fleshes out the backstory that was introduced in Breath of the Wild, and creates this epic tale that really builds on itself over the course of the game. The story flows really well, even when events completely depart from what was expected. To be fair, they don't really discuss the time travel that much, other than to acknowledge that it happened. I can understand people's frustration with that, but it's something that never really bothered me personally. I just ended up enjoying the story for what it was, an alternative version of events where we get to see what was supposed to happen had the champions survived. At the end of the day, I don't consider Age of Calamity's story to be canon in the Zelda universe, which may be why I enjoyed it more than some other people. Even though events didn't turn out as I expected, I still felt the story complemented Breath of the Wild story really well. I'm satisfied with how things turned out, and happy that I got to see more of what I loved about Breath of the Wild. Before I finally move on to the gameplay, I do want to quickly mention how this game might impact the Zelda timeline. Like I said, I don't consider Age of Calamity's story to be canon, but the Zelda team could very well try and pass it off as yet another branch on the Zelda timeline. If that turns out to be the case, there's still a lot of questions about what that would actually look like. Breath of the Wild seems to take place well after every other Zelda game that's come before it, but we still don't really know which part of the timeline it falls on. Some people have even theorized that Breath of the Wild represents a convergence of all the branches of the timeline, since it seems to reference games from multiple different branches. If this game is a convergence of the timeline, does that mean that the timeline is now branched again, or does it mean that one of the existing branches has now split into two separate ones? Or is this game simply not canon and it doesn't affect the timeline at all? We just don't know at this point and can only guess and speculate until the Zelda team gives us more information, if they ever decide to do that. Now that I've spent way more time talking about the story than I had planned to, let's talk about the part of the game I was a little worried about going in, the gameplay. If you remember from the start of this video, I told you that Age of Calamity was developed as a Musou game instead of an adventure game. That means there's none of the exploring or puzzle solving that usually define the Legend of Zelda series. Instead, the game is played through a series of missions that take place within the confines of a predetermined space. Additionally, combat takes place on a much larger scale. You will oftentimes be going up against hundreds of enemies at once as you try to achieve the various objectives the game tasks you with. Sometimes you need to capture an outpost on the battlefield, other times you may need to take down a certain number of enemies or a specific target. These objectives change from mission to mission, but you'll see all the different types pretty quickly. As for the combat itself, you'll be able to play as one of 18 different characters over the course of the game, including Link, Zelda, Impa, and the 4 champions. All 18 characters control the same way, but they each have unique abilities that give them distinct playstyles. For example, Link's unique ability is that he can shoot a flurry of arrows, while Impa's unique ability is that she can create clones of herself. In terms of similarities, everyone has regular and strong attacks, a dashing move, the ability to guard, and the ability to use the 4 different runes from Breath of the Wild. Everyone can also use one of 3 different elemental rods to damage large groups of enemies or weaken a strong enemy. Regular and strong attacks can be combined to create combo moves that differ from person to person. For example, Link can ride on his shield, Mipha can create a small typhoon, and Urbosa can shock her enemies with lightning. You'll unlock more combos for each character as you progress through the game, but I'll get to that a little later. Another ability that everyone has is something called a special attack. Basically, it's a move that does massive damage over a very large area. It can only be performed when this gauge in the upper left corner fills up, which happens when you defeat enemies or just do damage. This is easily the strongest move in your arsenal, and you're also immune to damage while the animation plays out, which is actually pretty useful when going up against powerful enemies. Speaking of enemies, they basically fall into 2 different categories, the standard weak enemies and the stronger, more powerful ones that I'll call bosses. The standard enemies include Bokoblins, Lizalfos, Peace, members of the Yiga clan, stuff like that. These guys aren't very powerful and are pretty easy to kill, so they don't pose much of a threat during combat. In my eyes, they basically served as fuel for the special attack gauge. The bosses, on the other hand, are the real threats during combat. This group mainly includes Moblins, Lynels, Taluses, Guardians, and Hinoxes. These guys are more powerful, have more health, and are just overall much harder to take down. Your strategy when fighting these guys revolves around this hexagon here called the weak point gauge. After certain attacks, bosses will become vulnerable, during which time this gauge will appear. If you can destroy all the triangles inside the gauge, you'll be able to use a powerful attack that's comparable to your special attack, dealing massive damage in the process. Combat basically involves fighting different combinations of standard enemies and bosses, with the difficulty obviously increasing later in the game. It's all pretty chaotic, but your map does a decent job of telling you where enemies are and where your objectives are. So those are the basics of combat. If you recall, I mentioned earlier that this style of gameplay isn't really my cup of tea. It usually gets too repetitive for me and I just end up getting bored. For that reason, I was a little concerned going into Age of Calamity. However, I'm happy to report that I loved this game's combat. I know that's strange considering how I normally feel about Musou games, but I really did enjoy every second of my playthrough. The combat feels like an alternate version of Breath of the Wild's combat. Many of the moves you have are the same as the ones in that game, just enhanced to be more flashy and epic. Let's use Link as an example. He can chuck a bunch of remote bombs at once, he can dash around more quickly and still use Flurry Rush, and he can use most of the weapons from Breath of the Wild in a variety of new hard-hitting combos. The movesets just feel familiar, even though they've been slightly altered for this game. In Breath of the Wild, you would oftentimes struggle fighting against several Bokoblins or Lizalfos at once. In Age of Calamity, you can take out 50 of them in one strike if you're so inclined. It takes what I loved about Breath of the Wild's combat and turns the dial up to 10, giving me an over-the-top Zelda experience that I just couldn't get enough of. The fact that we had such a variety of characters to play as also helped with my enjoyment. There were so many different playstyles to choose from that it kept me from really getting bored. Sure, I developed favorites that I played as more frequently, like King Rome and Mipha, but I always made sure to keep mixing up my character selection to keep things fresh. Even when I started to get into a rhythm of using some of the same moves over and over again, I still enjoyed the gameplay because I found it so fun and engaging. I will, however, mention one gameplay issue that I came across and I've seen other people talk about as well, which would be the frame rate. Because there can be so many enemies on the screen at once, the frame rate will sometimes drop when something big happens, like a special attack. The drop may be small, but it can be pretty big as well. Also, the camera doesn't always work the way I'd like it to. Sometimes I was dashing around trying to avoid one or several bosses, and I'd come up against a wall where the camera would suddenly shift dramatically and make it difficult for me to see what was going on. These issues are certainly worth mentioning, but honestly, they didn't have too big an impact on my gameplay experience. For starters, significant frame rate issues didn't happen that often for me, and even when they did happen, it was usually during a special attack or a weak point strike where I can't do anything until the animation ends anyway. Most of the time, the frame rate was perfectly fine for me. Likewise, the camera issue didn't have that much of a negative impact either. I was able to fix the camera fairly quickly and I never died because of a bad camera angle. Honestly, these issues had a bigger impact on my editing of this video more than they did on my gameplay. It was a bit of a struggle finding good clips among all the chaos in this game, and the occasional frame rate drop or camera shift didn't really help things. The only other gameplay feature I wanted to talk about is the Overworld Map. After you complete the opening story mission, you're brought to this map of Hyrule, where you'll spend your time choosing between missions and completing different quests. In addition to the game's story missions, Age of Calamity features a ton of challenges meant to help you level up your characters, earn resources, and just have fun. These are pretty cool because they offer up opportunities to practice with every character and to really challenge yourself once you've gotten better at the game. These will unlock as you progress through the story and once you complete some of the quests found throughout the map. There are quests for every character, and they involve turning in different resources to earn new skills and attributes. For example, one quest may have you turn in a bunch of monster parts or a variety of foods to get a character a new combo move or some extra hearts. These come in pretty handy because they give you more gameplay options and they make you more powerful. The resources you need to complete these quests can be earned by playing through missions or bought from the different vendors you unlock throughout the game. Most of the time, I found that I had the resources I needed from simply playing through the story and challenges. However, if you're having trouble finding a specific resource, you can use the Sheikah sensor to see which challenges and missions have the resources you're looking for. This makes gathering resources less of a chore because you don't have to guess where the right resources are. For me, the whole quest system basically serves as a nice side activity to balance out the combat. It was fun seeing what combo moves you earned from these and what new challenges popped up from completing them. Because there were hidden challenges that unlocked by completing some of these quests, I was incentivized to complete as many as I could to see which ones would give me new gameplay. There's also two services you unlock from quests early in the game, a blacksmith and a trainer. In addition to the resources resources you earn during a mission or challenge, you also earn weapons for the character you played as. These are unique to each character, drop with different strengths, and occasionally have special stats like increased damage or a higher drop rate for materials. The blacksmith allows you to fuse these weapons together to create more powerful versions. Fusing will increase the weapon's damage and eventually add more stats to it in the form of seals. Later in the game, you'll also get more options at the blacksmith like removing seals and de-rusting weapons. This service essentially allows you to customize each character to fit your playstyle. The trainer levels up your characters for a fee. Normally, you earn experience by playing through missions and leveling up that way. The trainer is an opportunity to quickly level up characters without needing to grind through missions. To be honest, I barely use this service. It's nice that the option is there, but I found that the characters I played as more frequently were already the proper level most of the time, and the characters you acquire later on already start at a fairly high level. Between this overworld map and the combat, there's a lot to do in Age of Calamity, and I found it all to be very enjoyable. It really says something when I keep playing a game well after I've already beaten the main story. This game is fun, engaging, and worthy of being a tie-in for Breath of the Wild. Whew. Finally finished. If you're still here, I really appreciate it. I'm still trying to find my voice in these things, and this video was a chance for me to try a longer, more free-flowing discussion instead of a more structured review. It's easier for me to do that when talking about something I'm truly passionate about, and Zelda is one of the things I'm most passionate about. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on the game if you're willing to share them. Part of why I made this channel was to have a place to discuss video games with other people, so I really do value hearing from anyone who watches my videos, even if they disagree with me. The only thing I love almost as much as playing video games is talking about them, so feel free to share your thoughts. In the meantime, I think I'm gonna go play through Breath of the Wild again. This game really got me in the mood, and I want to play through it one more time before Breath of the Wild 2 comes out. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this, and happy holidays!